This is Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers, with your hosts, Mike Thorne
and Miriam Riche.
Craftwork is recorded and produced in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River.
The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel Schroeder. Michael LaPointe is the author of The Creep, a novel published by Random House Canada. He has written for The New Yorker and The Atlantic, and he was a columnist with the Paris Review. His work has been anthologized in Best Canadian Stories and Best Canadian Essays, and he lives in Toronto.
Hi, Michael.
Hey, what's up? How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
So nice to meet you. I guess this is called meeting people.
Yep, this is what it's like.
Yeah.
We usually like to start by asking our guests, what were some of the books that first got you excited about reading or writing? What were some of the earliest literary loves for you?
Well, I think the first books I ever wrote when I was a very little kid were actually just kind of me rewriting the story of Jurassic Park over and over again. So I think I was actually very enamored of film and TV when I was very little. I loved the original novel Pinocchio, and I had this edition. It was this kind of gaudy yellow hardcover with these woodcuts in it that really sparked my imagination somehow. I guess the story of trying to become someone real, feeling artificial and trying to become something real, authentic, somehow spoke to me as a little kid. I don't quite know why that was. Maybe some sense of trying to fit in, trying to feel like one of the regular kids or something got to me. So I can definitely remember that one firing my imagination. And then I remember I kind of went through a strange spell where I didn't really read for a few years. Like I read very voraciously when I was a little kid. And then maybe between the ages of like 9 and 11 or something like that, I didn't really read that much. And I can recall one night having this strong feeling that I needed to read something, like I needed to put my eyes on words or something like that. And I went downstairs and asked my dad if he had like a book that was of any interest, that I might check out. And for some reason, he gave me this book by the novelist Russell Banks, who is well known for books like The Sweet Hereafter and Affliction and Continental Drift. And he gave me this book that he wrote in the late 1990s called Rule of the Bone, which was sort of like a Catcher in the Rye adjacent type of coming of age novel. But it was about a kid who just like kind of dropped out and smoked pot and went to Jamaica and ended up in some kind of criminal activity. And that was the first book. I was probably like 11 or 12 or something. That was the first book that I can recall reading that had this like sense that reading was not just an adult activity that was sort of laborious or like something that you'd be sort of patted on the head for doing, but that writing could have an element of danger, or you could be talking about things that were more gritty, more maybe speaking to what I had seen in film and TV. I hadn't really read a book like that felt so modern and kind of contemporary. And I don't know, I haven't read that book now in like 25 years or whatever, but I don't know if it would hold up as having any interest. But when I was kind of just on the cusp of pubescence, that book really excited me, felt dangerous. Reading felt like it had some kind of dangerous potential to it all of a sudden.
Thank you. That's a really interesting eye into your early reading experiences. Very niche, but I love that Jurassic Park and Pinocchio spoke to you, because I always think of, I don't know if you've seen Artificial Intelligence, the other Steven Spielberg film, which is basically a Pinocchio story. As you're talking about books that really resonated with you when you were younger, I had the privilege of, before this interview, you had sent to me a manuscript called This Is How You Will Know Me, an unpublished kind of experimental memoir. I liked the way that you wrote about early experiences with emotive techniques based on writers you were encountering as a kind of nascent artist. ranging from the cool detachment of Bret Easton Ellis to the onrushing modernism of Virginia Woolf. And I was curious, Michael, as a writer, how do you go about finding the most fitting tonal register for a given project? You can answer these two questions together or separately, but having read some of your work, I noticed that you do gravitate toward first-person POV, and I was curious if there's a reason for that.
To answer the tonal question first, I think the story somehow determines that. I mean, I'm very story focused, or at least I have been at times, less sort of voice focused, if that kind of contrast holds. The tone of a book always to me is determined by the sense of what I'm trying to get over in terms of the story. I think I do tend to write fairly cold. I think that just is like a natural register for me. I think probably that does have something to do with a lot of my early literary enthusiasms being writers like Don DeLillo and Joan Didion. And when I was a teenager, I really did like writers like Bret Easton Ellis, who kind of derived from the Didion DeLillo school. I think I did internalize a sense of this kind of marble cold tonal register as being a bit of a default. And I often have to sort of warm it up as I go along based on like what the emotional freight of a given story is. As for the first person question, I'm a bit agnostic on that one. Like I have written in the third person a decent amount. I haven't maybe published as much, so maybe that speaks to me being better at first person. But I think it's just a question of, if I'm rooted in a single POV, if that seems to me like a single character is going to be involved in every single scene in a book, then I'll probably go for a first person POV just to give the reader more of an intimate sense of that character's psychology. And if the way that the story is being told is crucial to the story, then that tends to be a good sign that I'll go for a first person. So, for example, in my book, The Creep, the story itself is so much oriented around, how stories are fabricated, how news is fabricated, how our sense of a historical moment is fabricated. And so that just seems to me to be best expressed through an individual where you can really see those processes registering on its individual consciousness. But the most recent book I wrote, which is currently just a manuscript called Ruby Red, is a very, very close third person POV, very, very close to the main character. But there's just an element of detachment and an element of observing that character from the outside in. And I think that's just because the way that the story is being told, the style is important, but like the mechanism of storytelling itself is not really under interrogation in that book. And so I felt a little bit of freedom to go to the third person register for a kind of detachment that, for whatever reason, just felt automatic. I guess that's kind of a long way around saying that it just seems obvious from the inception of the story what the demands of that story are in terms of tone.
I'm glad you mentioned The Creep. I wanted to zone in on some aspects of that novel. I was especially interested in some of the things you were doing with genre. It reads in many ways very much like a thriller. It has a sense of deliberate narrative design. It includes a shout out to John le Carré, and I was reminded at times of noir and hard-boiled fiction like Hammett and Chandler. Miriam mentioned a likeness to Inherent Vice Mode Pynchon. Did you plot that novel in advance, and how deliberate was that engagement with genre? Were you thinking about genre as you were writing The Creep?
I was thinking about genre a lot. I was specifically thinking about the horror genre, actually. I think I kind of aimed for horror and ended up in thriller. And my distinction between those genres is that when you're reading a thriller, you are deeply concerned about what's happening to the character in the story. And when you're reading a horror, you're concerned about what's going to happen to you, the audience of the book or the film, let's say. So, when I watch The Shining, I'm sort of somewhat invested in whether Wendy and Danny are going to escape from axe-wielding Jack Nicholson. But in the final analysis, I'm much more concerned about like whether when the movie's over and I go upstairs, the twins are going to be in my hallway or whatever. Like that's actually a much more pressing concern for me. So I tried to write a horror, but I think The Creep does end up being a bit more of a thriller. So I was thinking about genre a lot with that book. During that kind of period of my writing, kind of like a 10-year span, I was enjoying the conceit of borrowing genre elements and then using them to hang sort of literary concerns on. So the genre would provide a kind of handy, somewhat cheap, and in some cases tawdry apparatus that I could seize upon, and it would provide a kind of interest, automatic interest to the reader that would compel them to keep going through the book. And I could take them on these more sort of Byzantine journeys through, like, different concepts of history or art or whatever I was interested in talking about. And they would still travel with me because they were invested in the outcome, in a sort of genre-based sense of outcome. As for the plotting, I tend to, when I write a plotted story, if it's a novel, let's say the novel has like kind of 10 major plot points in it. I'll usually know like 6 or 7 of them before I actually get started on writing. And then the other ones, I'll just have a faith-based sense that I'll figure them out over the course of the composition. And then I tend to improvise endings, especially unless the ending is extremely clear. Like I have some kind of spectacular idea in mind. I'll sort of leave it up to the inspiration, or I'll let what comes before determine the ending. I have a good amount of foresight, but not quite that much foresight to know the ending before I've written.
If I heard correctly, did you say it took you 10 years to write The Creep?
No, it took me like eight months to write The Creep. It's just that I wrote in that mode for like 10 years, I would say.
Okay. I'm writing my first novel at the moment, so I feel like I'm going to take 10 years. But it remains to be seen. So,
I mean, it would be nice to take that long to write a book and lavish 10 years worth of attention on a book. I admire writers who take that long, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of a privilege to be able. I know, like, Donna Tartt takes a decade for a book, but she like calls herself a miniaturist and tries to do a kind of Dickensian level of diorama detail. All this to say, you made a juxtaposition between magic tricks and novel writing. To quote you, I know it's not the nicest to hear someone else read what you wrote, but to quote you, you say, whereas with a book you painstakingly labor to achieve an effect you'll never see, the reader silently alone with themselves, miles and miles away, the effect of a magic trick is immediate, right in front of you, unsubtle in the extreme, unquote. So yeah, this really resonated with me because obviously to write a novel, or write anything at all, but of course a novel, you have to spend a lot of time alone. Even when you're not writing, you need to kind of like keep your mind uncluttered by too many, I don't know, social engagements, what have you, in order to keep the thread going. And so I thought it was like a cool way to put it. It's not the solitude that gets to me so much as the absence of feedback, which is sort of like, I guess, when you do a magic trick, people can immediately tell you whether it worked or not. But when you're writing a book, it's kind of like planning a long magic trick. And if you show it to someone too early, it could get embarrassing or discouraging to you. So I guess I'm just interested in the kind of like psychological element of any writer who spends a lot of time alone writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the writer is often, if not envious, then at least they note the difference between their art and basically any other. The musician gets to have instantaneous dynamic response from the audience. Even a filmmaker who conceives of narrative on an extremely grand scale and works very painstakingly, first of all, that's a collaborative art. So you constantly are in a dynamic of, a social dynamic with the art form, but they get to sort of, drop in on the theater and see how their work is playing and that sort of thing. Whereas a writer is never truly present with their reader in the experience of reading. Even if you sit with someone and read over their shoulder as they are reading, you are never truly hearing the words as they are playing in their mind, and you're never seeing the work as the reader is seeing it. You work in isolation, and then the reader receives you in isolation, and these two solitudes never really merge. In my case, when I wrote The Creep, and The Creep was published kind of into the teeth of the pandemic. It was June 2021, I guess. And so even those few social events that would cluster around a book's release, I was sort of deprived of. I would do my book launch the way that we're doing this interview, like through a Zoom link or whatever. And that was sort of odd, not because I care that much about the publishing side of things if I want to throw a party, I'll just throw a party. There's writing a book is the most laborious way you could possibly end up planning a party. But there is a sense in which, after that long period of solitude, the book publicity moment is, I think, psychologically useful to the writer, just as a way to reintegrate into society, essentially, or integrate the book into society in some way. And so it was kind of odd not to get that catharsis where basically the release of the book and the celebration of the book was as lonely as the composition of the book had been. But that's fine, I guess. Whatever, it's not a big deal.
I know what you mean, though. I actually had the same experience releasing a book during the pandemic, and there was something so oddly airless about it. I don't know. There is always, I feel, this kind of postpartum sense of emptiness, or there's an anticlimax finishing a book sometimes, even once it's out in the world. It's very elliptical, and it's extra elliptical when you release it in the teeth of a pandemic, as you said. So I feel your pain there. I guess while we're talking about The Creep, something else that interested me in that book is the way it offers insights into journalistic process. There's one excerpt that had me thinking about the writing process writ large. Quote, "You only have the story you're going to tell. That's what I had buried somewhere in the notes on my desk, if I could just focus long enough to find it," end quote. This resonated with me because I often feel like I'm finding the stories I write rather than creating them. Does that hold true for you as well?
I think that is true for me when I have done journalism in particular, or nonfiction, I guess. You identify a field of investigation or a field of inquiry, and you take your notes within that field, and then it becomes almost like one of those magic eye posters where you have to sort of zone out in precisely the right way as you're taking in the scope of your notes, and then some sort of picture becomes clear within them. When I'm writing fiction, I think they tend to emerge from a little bit of a spark, a particular idea seems suddenly to make the story clear to me, and then the story just sort of unspools from that spark, to mix metaphors brutally. The story kind of just runs away from me on its own velocity or something. It tends to be a fictional idea for me that is solid or viable, ends up becoming a rallying point around which notes that I've gathered for years will suddenly start to cluster. It just seems to attract other ideas to it. But that's, I think, partly because of just the innate differences between these two modes of writing. When I'm writing nonfiction, I have a fidelity to truth telling, and so it's important to cover as much as possible to get as fulsome a picture as I can of the truth, and then begin to apply an art making technique to that field to tell a story in a way that is going to be engaging for a reader. But first and foremost, it's the gathering, the research and the gathering is the important thing. With a work of fiction, it's all art, so I'm really much more focused on the kind of momentum of an idea than anything else.
Something I noticed with regard to your fiction and your nonfiction alike, I admire the way in which you weave niche interests into these works. For example, in Dice Roll, your monthly column in the Paris Review, it's the art of the gamble. In Operation Morning Light, your long-form podcast, it's the story of the Cosmos 954 disaster. for fiction, like Private Hands, a short story that you published in The Walrus, has this sort of like archival history of folk music. Other work, I mean, I was just going through your backlog in reverse chronological order, something like The Shade, a shorter piece. There's a lot of like ornithology and like tree stuff. I know there's a proper term, arboralism or whatever in it. I'd love to hear more about your process when it comes to collecting information, like bodies of information, and presenting them through narrative, because regardless of whether it's fiction or nonfiction, there's the presentational element of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks for reading all that stuff. That's so cool. The two best things I say about being a writer, like the two great advantages, are being in charge of your own time, largely speaking, and being able to essentially build a career around following your curiosities. So the diversity of subject matter that you identify across those works is really just a result of me getting interested in things and then diving into them and then beginning to feel like maybe a story is going to emerge from it. In the case of the nonfiction stuff, like the column about gambling, a lot of that oftentimes is sort of me repurposing the research that I've done for a piece of fiction. I think in that case, I was writing a novel about like, that sounds so crazy, but I think for like a half a year or something like that, I was writing a book about like some kids who ended up like running a sports book out of like a Subway sandwich shop or something like that. It's kind of a strange idea. I don't really know what I was thinking there, but it caused me to like start researching gambling a lot and getting a better grip on it. And I just had all these notes that I'd taken, or all these people that I'd identified as being really interesting, and didn't have anywhere to put it. So then ended up doing that thing for the Paris Review for a couple of years. There's a way in which I don't so much write like this anymore, because I've just kind of gone through some changes in the last couple of years. But during that 10-ish year period that I talked about there, where I was writing with a bit more sense of genre, more genre elements, that was when I was writing a bit more with a focus on external reality, I guess, like identifying subjects that attracted me and then researching them and then constructing stories out of that curiosity and research. And part of the fun of that is that when you're researching, you get to read imaginatively. So you're reading in a way that you're educating yourself about a subject, but at the same time, there's like this other part of your brain that's sort of whirring, where you're like kind of channeling what you're reading into seeing if any kind of sparks come off of it. Like if any little phrases that you encounter over the course of your research seem like they have an application to a piece of fiction or to a story that you have in mind. And that's kind of fun, like to read that way and to research that way. But it's been a little bit since I wrote like that. I just have kind of moved into a different phase, I guess, let's say. And it's not that I'm not interested in external reality anymore, but that work, I was very far away from my actual lived experience and my actual sense of self and my individual personality, I guess. I was sort of traveling into these other worlds and imagining myself into them. And lately, I've just sort of been going through some changes.
That's also interesting. I can relate to getting some kind of subject stuck in my craw and wanting to do something with it. Are there any subjects that have attracted you in the past that you've never managed to find an application for? Or did you manage to kind of get them all out of the mental backlog, so to speak?
No, there's a few. I'm really quite interested in like physical space. I'm just kind of like a lifelong renter, and probably like 50% of my total lifetime earnings have gone into rent. And I'm very fascinated with the kind of landlord-tenant dynamic, as well as the construction of physical space. And I tried to write a novel and like a screenplay about a landlord-tenant dynamic at least 5 different times. It's almost like a story dynamic that I return to in between projects that actually do end up working out. I just constantly kind of go back to this landlord idea and wanting to write about it. For whatever reason, I find it really difficult to write, but that's something that I just constantly return to and try to make something out of. And then I get like 30 or 40,000 words into something, and it just has no life to it, and then I put it away, and then usually the next thing that I think about ends up becoming an actual book. So it's almost like this weird purgation that I go through every now and then, where I go back to the landlord story. But yeah, I try to avoid it now because I know that it's sort of doomed.
That's extremely interesting. We recently did an interview with Neben Ruthnam, and I asked him, because I've had this recent experience where I had a novel that I had fully written, and for a number of reasons, it was set aside for a long time out on a submission cycle. And I came back to it and realized I no longer felt connected to it, and that an entire third of the novel needed to be rewritten if I ever wanted to allow it to see the light of day, which might never happen. So I asked Neben if he had ever abandoned projects at like a late stage. And it's interesting to hear that you have one or more that you've reached that 30 to 40,000 word point and for whatever reason done away with them. Is that something that has happened to you numerous times, or is it fairly rare? Do you usually see projects through to fruition when they reach a certain point?
No, it happens very frequently. The one about the landlord, I think that's happened to me at least twice. The one about the kids running the sports book out of the Subway shop, that was like about 70,000 words or something like that before I bailed on it. I wrote about 50,000 words about this like superannuated rock star taking a trip on like the Queen Elizabeth II transatlantic liner. God. Yeah, no, the list goes on. I don't know. And when I say the ideas out loud, I can sort of now see why I never saw these projects through. But it's hard to tell what is going to have the actual juice to like give rise to a viable draft. I'm not a great predictor of that. So I just sort of do my preparation as best I can and get into it. Yeah, like last year, I think I wrote 20,000, 30,000 words of a book about an actor or something that didn't ever end up becoming real. So the good thing, I suppose, is that it doesn't tend to happen twice in a row. Usually, like, I'll do that and then somehow the next one will be real. If I could identify why it happens, it's usually because I'm writing too soon after completing something else. And I just don't have the imaginative or physical stamina to be writing again. But I enjoy writing so much that I don't want to stop. So that's usually the problem, is that I'm like prematurely working.
It's interesting to hear when other writers describe this process of abandoning so many projects, because I find it so painful. Maybe I'm being too precious about it, but when you spend that much time with a story and with a set of characters, you do become attached to it in some sense. So that's fascinating to me. Some of the things you're saying have me think about an interview I read that you did with Curiosity House Books. You say the process of rewriting requires a truly superhuman effort of patience. The more time you take between drafts, the better, and the longer you take to rewrite each scene, the better. Something about that notion of time, how much time you spend with a project and between projects and so on. What are you typically looking for when you revise a novel or a story? What aspects or areas do you find most cumbersome to edit?
I don't know if I actually would say that there's like a consistent difficulty that I hit. It's more just that constantly I'm disappointed in the quality of the previous draft. And so you just have to like find a way to continually apply pressure to it. I maybe would object to the word superhuman, but I guess I agree with my old quote there mostly still. I have never regretted not showing someone a piece of writing. I've only ever regretted like sharing something too soon. So I tend to think that the more time you can enforce between drafts, the better. The more time you spend away from a draft and the more you forget about what's in something that you've written, the better. That way, just it refreshes your eyes and allows you to see the book somewhat as another reader would. I sort of have this view of the drafting process, is that it's like a kind of oil painting, like a history painting, like The Night Watch by Rembrandt or something like that. Some narrative, large scale narrative work. And it's easy as the viewer of such a work to think that the artist like took up their brush and dabbed it in oil paint and just went at the blank canvas and put the characters on the canvas. But in reality, and I don't know if this is actually how Rembrandt worked or whatever, but the first markings that are made on the canvas are done with like charcoal or some very primitive tool. And all that they're doing is getting the lines right, the gesture, the energy. It's like a sort of foreshadowing of the eventual work that is going to exist. And once that energy is there, once the lines are right, then you can begin applying the first coat of paint. And then you just layer and layer and layer and layer until you're working with extremely fine brushes, extremely fine details. And that's the surface that the viewer eventually sees, and it looks perfect. But it's actually a process of layering. And that first draft of the painting, let's say, is just charcoal lines, very primitive. And that's what a rough draft is for me always. It's not about having the sentences be perfect. It's about having like the bones of the story be there, or the energy that you're trying to convey should be there. And if you've written a successful rough draft, that's what's successful about it, is that it conveys the energy that you hope will eventually be there if you just spend enough time, layering and building it up. It's very rare for me that there's even like a single sentence that is in my rough draft that survives unrevised to the final draft. I rewrite like crazy, but even that when I'm demolishing whole sections or rewriting from scratch, it's still reliant upon that first foundation that I've laid down in the rough draft, when the energy was there or the beats were there or the lines were right.
That's very relatable. I use exactly the same oil painting analogy to kind of keep myself on track, because I used to, when trying to write a novel, try to like polish the first chapter, like make it really nice before even drafting the book. So Anne Lamont says, should you first drafts just not be so frightened by how drafty the like kind of charcoal or pencil process is. So I'm doing my master's degree at University of New Brunswick. We have a shortage of prose supervisors. So having to get people who are like purely academic to supervise you, it's like they want to see you write a book like chapter by chapter and say like, oh, I'll just give you some line edits. And to me, I was thinking of the oil painting thing just this morning, because I was like, I can't exactly like give someone a corner of your painting that's really finely detailed. So
some writers have worked like that. I think of someone like Flaubert or whatever, who would make sure that each page was perfect before he would move on to the next one. I tend to think that that's like a much rarer way to work. And it seems to me, at least anecdotally, that those writers who I meet who get really hung up on making a chapter perfect before they move on to the next one tend to never finish. They exhaust themselves, or they are so concerned with what they have already done that they forget where they are going next. I tend to think that the best thing that you can ever say about a first draft is that it exists at all. Because the danger, we were just talking about works that fail like halfway or a third of the way through the initial composition process. That's the scary thing, is when you get 50,000 words into a 80,000 word book or whatever, and then it dematerializes in your hands. That's the fear, is that the book just won't ever exist at all. Once you have a draft of any kind, even if it's complete garbage, it still exists, and you can then work with it. As long as you just have the endurance and the commitment, you can build it up into something that is at least passable. But yeah, you can't work with what's not there. So I always tend to encourage people to like write their first draft more or less as quickly as they possibly can, just to get it out. And then the real work begins, which is, for me anyway, revision always is where the real work is at.
Totally. I didn't know that about Flaubert. They call him like the martyr of style, don't they? So I guess that might be where it comes from.
I think I heard Vonnegut as well was the same way. Like he would rewrite, it might be self-mythologizing or whatever, but he would like write page by page. So he would perfect a page before. I don't know.
Yeah,
that seems.
That was the Flaubert thing. Yeah, he would try to do one page every day, at least when he was writing Bovary, which is kind of like his most famous and exemplary like process, where he really brought his all of his ideas to bear upon a work.
In the introduction to This Is How You Will Know Me, you're talking about like the concept of like the spirit of art leaving you, like the idea that one day you might wake up and not want to write anymore, or not be able to write anymore. Is this something that truly happened to you, and do you feel comfortable talking about it?
Yes, that did happen to me last November, I want to say. I had this rather terrifying experience where I'd been working on a book for maybe 5 or 6 months, and it wasn't really going very well. And one night I was lying in bed, and I had this sensation of like my body was like deflating. It felt like air was like escaping from my body, and I couldn't like plug whatever hole it was leaking from. And I had this deadly certainty that what was leaving my body was like the spirit of art, the spirit of storytelling. And I hadn't ever really noticed that it was there. It had been such a constant companion throughout my life. And it felt as if, I don't know, it was almost like the spirit of art had like entered me when I was very little and then had stayed with me for a while and then was like cutting its losses and like fleeing my body to go find some other some other host or something like that. It was a very devastating feeling. That was the end of that book project. I never looked at that manuscript again. I spent the next day just kind of like curled up on my couch, like contemplating suicide. And it was a really terrifying experience. And out of that experience came this memoir that you're referencing, which is unpublished and probably unpublishable, frankly, called This Is How You Will Know Me. So I did end up sort of snatching victory from the jaws of defeat somehow and finding a way to tell stories again. By the end of writing that manuscript, I came to rethink whether it was the spirit of storytelling that was leaving me or whether it was some other kind of entity within myself. And maybe, in fact, that what was fleeing me was like a sense of inhibition around a certain form of truth-telling, a certain form of frankness within my work that I'd been evading for like all my life. And I did end up being grateful for that moment because it oriented me on a different path. But at the time, it was like harrowing, extremely harrowing.
Thanks for sharing. I mean, there's nothing, writing just is such a balm for living, I guess. Like, it is hard to think of, I don't know, what would you do with your free time? I mean, writing just takes up so much time, and I'm grateful to it for that. And I do think that that manuscript that we keep discussing, I genuinely find it to be really compelling and really interesting. And I'm interested in what you've said about kind of like this inhibition. This does directly tie into a question that I have for you. A lot of the narratives of yours that I've been looking at in preparation for this interview feature inscrutable writer protagonists. I'm thinking of, well, the events at X had someone obviously grappling with horrific truths about residential schools. There's also More Love, which seemingly very different. It's about a couple vacationing in Greece, right? In Naxos. And here's a quote from the story that I think sums up what I'm trying to say about your protagonists. The narrator's girlfriend goads him. She says, "I want you to say what you mean. You're worried that if you say what you want, you'll lose everything." I find this to be a really interesting paradox, of sort of like writing around the subject rather than writing through it. And I'm curious what draws you to what I consider to be kind of like this interestingly evasive approach to narrative.
I don't know if I'm drawn to it so much as it's actually like a symptom of my own inhibitions as a writer that, I'm probably gradually trying to work away from. I often think that, like, artistically speaking, my writing career has been like a process of peeling back layers of resistance in myself to get closer to a certain kind of frankness and directness that I am very attracted to. I am much more attracted to directness in a work than I am to the elliptical mode. The writers that I admire tend to just name the thing that they are actually talking about as opposed to sort of smuggling it in some roundabout fashion. And so I'm kind of constantly trying to work toward that. In More Love, the story that you quote from there, I think the narrator of that story is speaking frankly and directly about his experience, but the kind of catch with that story is that he's not the one orchestrating his experience. His girlfriend is the one actually sort of compelling him through the story, through the plot points of the story. And so in a way, he's just like sort of unaware of what's actually happening. And so there's a limitation to how clear and direct he can be about the events that are unfolding. But within my own sort of like artistic philosophy, I'm trying constantly to get closer to being as frank as I possibly can. That's the work that I gravitate toward the most and am striving to make.
I read an interview with you where you said you're probably one of the 0.01% of creative writing graduates who works full-time in writing, which seems like a fair estimate to me. And that between magazine work, books, and some TV and podcast writing, you are able to make a living, which is indeed a very rare thing in 2025. I'm trying to navigate a career in academia while also finding time for writing in the little spaces in between all the other work. What does that look like for you? Do you have a strict daily routine? Are you pretty regimented as a writer? Does it vary from week to week? I guess I'm curious about your schedule and your process.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think I said that quote to like my university magazine who like had reached out to me, which is a real kind of dick thing to say, frankly. I sort of wish I hadn't said that. It's sort of mean.
I didn't take it that way.
Well, good. But it is true that like certainly, the creative writing degree is like a very sort of fraught thing in terms of like how it translates into a career. I've had to always have side jobs and things. I currently have one, but I've always found a way to get jobs that I don't know if I should actually say this on a podcast, but like jobs that you can steal a lot of time from, let's just say, jobs that are more like performance based rather than like hours based. So as long as you get the work done, it really doesn't matter what time of day you're doing it at. And so that's always allowed me to maintain a routine. And I do have a routine, I guess. Definitely, I have a routine. I'm a pretty routinized person, I think, in my daytimes, especially. So basically, I wake up and I have a shower and I have breakfast. And then I take my coffee to my desk and I write until lunchtime. And then I have lunch and then I write until I can't really do it anymore. And pretty much I do that 7 days a week and have done that more or less 7 days a week for my entire adult life. I'm not very good at like taking time off. I probably take off like fewer than 5 full days a year, probably, in terms of like actually just not doing anything work related for a day, which I don't actually recommend. I think that that's actually like pretty unhealthy and is not even necessarily conducive to like productivity. I think that's more my sort of like attachment anxiety to the desk and the comfort of that space and the kind of sense of serenity and probably control that gives me over my life. But I think it's certainly possible to be just as productive as I am, if not more so, and at a greater quality by working far less. So it's not, I would never recommend that to people. But what I would recommend, like to anyone who wants to be a writer, is I always just say that you have to fall in love with the process of writing itself. That's the only thing that is constant throughout your career, is the process of writing. All of the external elements of writing, whether it be people reading your work or reviewing your work or doing interviews like this one or going to a party where you're at the center of attention or whatever, all that stuff is like completely comes and goes. There's times for that and then there's other times where that's not happening. And the only thing that you can rely on, the only thing you can say for sure will be there tomorrow is your process as a writer. So if you don't like being at the desk with a blank page, if that doesn't actually excite you and energize you and get you out of bed in the morning, then I'm not saying you're not a writer in some like derogatory sense, but like probably it's not the best way to spend your life. Like there's probably something else you would rather be doing. You just should go out and find it. So I think it's not necessarily having a routine, like, okay, yeah, that can be one way to have a viable and sustainable process. But just loving the act of writing itself, I think, is the thing that every writer needs to find in order to have a viable career. You need to like addict yourself to the act of writing. So yeah, that's always like what I kind of tell younger writers. That and always say yes when the bank offers to raise your credit limit, I would say, are my two kind of pieces of advice.
Excellent advice. Always love to hear about a writer's routine. I actually thought of two questions while you were speaking, and I think they're actually related. First of all, like something I've been toying with lately is like sometimes I'll just wake up at like 6 a.m. and not be able to fall back asleep. And it feels like too early to get out of bed and like that'll fuck my day over. But at the same time, another obsession, and this is where it will all come together, is like tricking my brain, because I also am quite inhibited in my writing. I often, I use third person, for example, in the novel I'm writing because I'm afraid that someone might think that the protagonist is me. They're like fairly unlikable, and that's always a fear of mine. I know, like most writers know, like obviously first person is a construction, but I'm more afraid of like non-writers in my life who assume that the first person is you. But all this to say, I guess I'm talking about like the unconscious, like routine and audience. I know I'm kind of rambling a bit, but like this idea, yeah, like I said, this impetus for me wanting to change my routine is like, is there a way to like get past whatever kind of filter or censor in one's brain? And I know I keep referencing this mysterious unpublished text, This Is How You Will Know Me, but you do write a bit about audience in that and kind of like writing for an audience versus not writing for an audience. All this to say, I think inhibition, the unconscious, and audience are kind of interrelated. And I'm just wondering what either of you would have to say, or if you have any advice for an early career writer such as myself.
It seems to me that some writers just come right out of the gate without inhibition. And I certainly admire those writers a great deal, and those artists generally, whether in any medium, who just seem to have like a completely clean pipeline between impulse and expression. Those to me are kind of like the supreme artists. And I don't know whether that's actually true or whether that's just like itself a kind of artifice, but it's persuasive enough that it feels true to me. And so I definitely bow down before those writers. For those writers who have inhibitions, I'm not sure that there's any piece of advice I can give that would do anything to like identifying the problem is not actually going to solve the problem. I think James Purdy, the writer, once said that his advice to young writers was to banish shame. And that's something that I can repeat, but I don't know if it's actually like something that people can internalize just from hearing the words. For me, it's like, I think you just need the experience of failing in multiple ways. Like I've written work that was entirely for myself, and it has like failed to be published and find an audience. And I've written work that is very, very, very intensively focused on pleasing an audience, and that work has failed as well. And so like once you've done that, like it's kind of like, well, I might as well just write to please myself, because clearly my idea of an audience is erroneous. And so I don't actually know what I'm talking about when I talk about an audience. You spend a couple years writing a book that is very audience oriented and it fails to find an audience. You may as well have spent that 2 years, or whatever, writing some abstruse, like experimental, prose text. You'd have the same results basically. So there's a certain liberation in failure, because it makes you realize that you don't know anything about, again, you just don't know anything about these external realities to the writing life. The only thing you know is like what's happening right in front of you with the page and your reaction to what's happening. That's like the only thing you can say for certain about the whole experience of writing. So yeah, inhibition tends to come from like these negative interjects in your head where you're describing, where you are frightened off of the first person because you're scared that someone is going to associate you with that character. And it's like, you don't know that that's true. Like you're inventing some kind of hypothetical audience member and then anticipating their reactions to it. Probably what you're really articulating is some kind of fear that you have with identifying with your character. and you're like projecting that fear onto like a hypothetical other. So I don't know. Yeah, work through that on your own, I guess.
It's those pesky cognitive distortions in writing and life. You recently partnered with Toronto Public Library on a panel series concerning great books under 200 pages. And I was just curious to hear your opinion. What are the key features of a short classic, would you say?
Well, the key feature of a short classic is that it's short, which for me means under 200 pages. If it starts with a 1 and is 3 digits, then it is a short book. I don't know if there's actually like any kind of pattern that otherwise you could say about these books. I mean, the 5 books I chose, like, it's like Voyage in the Dark by Jean Rhys and Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton, Sula by Toni Morrison, Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata, and The Lover by Marguerite Duras. And it's like, oh, and In a Lonely Place by Dorothy B. Hughes. And I mean, I couldn't think of a more unlike group of books. So yeah, I don't know if there's actually really a sense. I mean, I guess there's a sort of compression to them necessarily. They're not books that have a lot of space in them in terms of like, I don't know how to put this. There are very capacious books. I think of like books like Middlemarch maybe, or Bleak House or something, where you have these enormous capacious paragraphs that have a lot of space to them. They're almost like you can imagine yourself reposing on these paragraphs, whereas it tends to be that in these short classics you have a compression and they're kind of hard and gem-like. This is an extremely impressionistic way of describing this, but it's not to say that they're not spacious or capacious, in the sense that I don't think that any of those books is smaller in kind of the scope of its storytelling ambition than a book like, well, I mean, it's hard to rival Middlemarch for ambition, but you know what I mean? I think it's just to say that the prose itself has a sense of compression to it necessarily, but the amount of dreaming and daydreaming you can do off of those sentences rivals that of any big book. And other than that kind of vague impressionistic sense of compression, I'm not really sure that there's like a through line throughout those books. Other than that, I like them all a lot.
I love all the ones I've read. Although for whatever reason, I didn't respond to In a Lonely Place, and I don't know why. I love that era of noir fiction, I think, and I love the film too. But for some reason, sometimes maybe I feel like I meet a book at the wrong moment or something. I need to go back to it. When I saw it on that list, I was like, okay, I love these other texts, so I need to look at it again.
I was just excited that you liked past tense Bret Easton Ellis. I know he's like, I feel like he's very misunderstood by those who have never read him before. So, I mean, he's a little like crazy now. His podcast is enjoyable, but he says some pretty wild things on there. I don't know. It's rare to meet people who like Bret Easton Ellis.
I think I will always say that like Less Than Zero and American Psycho are good books. Even when I was at the height of my like Bret Easton Ellis enthusiasm, which is to say when I was like 17 years old, I wasn't really super sold on his other books. I think again, like that when I was a teenager and I was discovering literature as like an art form, not just as like books and you read books, but as like literature as an art form, I was very into like music and film and art forms that had a sense of danger about them. I hadn't really ever encountered writers who were working in a mode that felt dangerous. And that's just because of what I'd been exposed to. And so, I think there's at times something a little cheap to the kind of form of danger that is in a Bret Easton Ellis novel. And I think they can often be very repetitive books. Like I think when he's at his worst, he's just sort of like trying to throw violence at a reader for a kind of presumed reaction that is not necessarily actually pushing an envelope. But yeah, when you're 17, and you hear about a writer like Bret Easton Ellis who becomes like some sort of literary rock star at the age of like 21, suddenly the act of writing has this like excitement to it. It feels comparable to being a rock star or whatever. It's not actually, in fact, anywhere near as cool, but you can sort of delude yourself temporarily into thinking that it will be. So yeah, I mean, like he was attractive again for that sense of danger, and I just hadn't really read writers like that who were as sort of numb and jaded and sarcastic as I felt at that age. I hadn't seen that reflected in literature. So yeah, I mean, I haven't read him in forever. I read like the first maybe 100 pages of the Shards or whatever it was called. That latest book of his. I don't know, I just couldn't really get into it. It just seemed sort of like a rehash of the same milieu and material of those books and stuff, and it just didn't really excite me. The retrospective gaze maybe wasn't really functioning for me, whereas those books that emerged exactly from those moments, I think, bottled up a certain energy that was exciting when I kind of uncorked it for myself later on.
And did you mention in that same memoir, Hubert Selby Jr. was an early, he was one of a gateway drug for me as a young reader as well. He's almost, in some senses, like the opposite of Bret Easton Ellis. Like there's this kind of onrush and this velocity to Selby Jr.'s language and a kind of passionate empathy. So I thought that was an interesting contrast between those two. They're both interested in violence and addiction. And
I think and I think, again, like kind of my plastic brained adolescent self was attracted to the violence and the sex and the just things that, again, I didn't associate with books, like things that I associated more with film or with music, things that I just hadn't encountered in books before. But yeah, I had this kind of like 21st century idea of like transgressive literature. And I say 21st century because it's literature that was published 50 years before that I still sort of identified as like transgressive. But I was very into Less Than Zero and Played As It Lays and Last Exit to Brooklyn and Naked Lunch and stuff like that. And all that stuff really excited me. But I think I was sort of into it for the wrong reasons. Like I didn't have a grasp of literature that would allow me to actually like understand how these works were situated in some kind of like history of the art. I was just trying to kind of break up a sort of genteel picture of literature that was in my head. I just wanted to sort of smash it. And these were like the blunt instruments with which I did that. And it was important. But then, I think a lot of writers I'm sure that you guys, have encountered these writers over time who like just never really outgrow those sort of enthusiasms, and still think that like Charles Bukowski is the ultimate writer or whatever. And those are all great writers that I named, and Bukowski is a great writer, but their imitators are just so unbelievably infantilized and like sort of frozen in a moment where they think that they are still being transgressive by aping those writers. And it's like that work has been done and it's now you have to move into something else. So I think that those influences are still somewhere inside of me, but that's like one sedimentary layer in a kind of series of other influences and enthusiasms that I had subsequent to them.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting because there's so many ways to take that journey too, like maybe slightly embarrassing. You know what? I'll own it. I got into Bret Easton Ellis like in my 30s. I was like got into Henry James and Bret Easton Ellis at the same time and was like alternating between the two. But yes, I agree with you. It's good not to calcify in your tastes and when the envelope's been pushed, it doesn't need to be pushed anymore. So I do prefer the transgressive writing of yore rather than now.
But what is transgressive writing now? Like who is identified as being a transgressive writer now?
There's like a book called Rejection by Tony Tulathamu. That's kind of transgressive, I guess.
I mean, he's a great writer. I don't know if I felt like it was transgressive. I guess I associate transgressive literature now with more like sort of bad Welbeck imitators where they're sort of like being a bit of an edgelord or whatever, or being like deliberately politically incorrect or whatever is sort of like people's idea of being transgressive. Like it used to be that like transgressive literature was offending like religious sensibilities or kind of like social gentle social norms or like bourgeois norms. It seems to me now like writers who are really obsessed with being transgressive, like they're trying to provoke like liberal norms or like kind of politically correct norms or whatever, which is just like kind of revanchist sort of form of transgression to me. So I don't really know who's actually writing that way. I don't know if that's really work that needs to be done anymore. People can stop. So you guys are both horror people, you would say?
I'm like transgress. No, I'm not transgressive, but like I like Mary Gates. It's like dark, I guess, like a lot of like sex and death in a completely non-transgressive or unintentionally transgressive way. But yeah, like more like just dark literary stuff. Mike is like very capital H horror, if I may say so, Mike.
Yeah, I'll embrace it. I mean, I love horror. I'm proud to be called a horror writer.
Yeah, Mary Gaitskill is awesome. It's a great model to have for sure, if that's someone you're aiming for. I mean, I think when you read something like her early work, like Bad Behavior or something like that, it does have that kind of transgressive air to it. And I don't know, we're probably bandying about this word transgressive in a way that's going to piss people off, but it still just feels very like fresh. And I think representing those people and those perspectives will always have a certain kind of edge to it, or a certain allure of the transgressive or glamour of the transgressive to it. She's just an incredible writer.
Yeah, it's more like uninhibited, I guess, than trans. Like she's just so honest in something like Two Girls Fat and Thin too. I mean, it's pretty like, I don't know. My mom tried to read it and was like, "This is disgusting." I don't know why you would read something like this, but I mean, she's just, I don't know. It's just coming out of her. She's not thinking about it too hard. So yes, maybe I should stop joking about the term transgressive. But yeah, it's just like her stuff is dark and it goes to places that are not pleasant. But if that's where your brain wants to spend time, where it wants to spend time. And I don't know. I mean, I guess as a survivor of sexual violence, it's like, it's an interesting thing to write about. So yeah, that's what I like to work on.
It's funny, like, yeah, when my parents both read The Creep, they're divorced, so they read it independently. So I got to sell them 2 copies rather than 1, I guess. But, they were both very like shocked by the sex and stuff like that. And it's funny because they're like baby boomers or whatever. And it's like we were saying, like a lot of these kind of actually pathfinding transgressive writers around sex and violence, like they were writing long before my parents were like my age, and like, for them to see what I was doing as somehow outre or like out on some outer edge of, it's just sort of odd to me. Like I think because I came up reading those sorts of books, I always just sort of thought that that's what literature was in a way. Like that's what it is like it's talking about dark subject matter. It never seemed to me to be like particularly daring to like talk about that stuff. It seemed to me just kind of like another element of fiction writing that is either necessary for the story or not necessary for the story, but it's not like going to generate some pearl clutching or whatever. Like I didn't think that was at all going to be people's reaction to it, but a lot of people over the age of 50, let's say, were very like scandalized by the sex, especially in that book, which just seemed so strange to me because it's like, I thought you guys were part of the 60s. Weren't you like having orgies and listening to Hills and stuff? I don't get it. So yeah.
Yeah, and reading like, I don't know, like Updike and Cheever and Roth. They were like extremely sexual. In This Is How You Will Know Me, I really enjoyed the anecdote that you shared about your father giving you notes on a book that was already finished. I think that's relatable to us too. So
yeah, the book was like it had been proofed already and stuff, and was on its way to the printer, and I was still getting notes, I guess, from the old man.
Have you read anything memorable recently? Any books that have come across your?
So the last novel that I read that really struck me was a book called The Sorrow of War by Bao Ninh, which is I think a very popular book when it came out in Vietnam. It was sort of like one of the first very frank and sort of anti-war novels to emerge from the North Vietnamese army. And it was translated into English in the 1980s. And I believe it's being reissued like sometime in the like early next year. So you might hear some stuff about that. It's sort of billed as like the Vietnamese All Quiet on the Western Front or something like that, which is maybe a little inaccurate. Like the circumstances of those wars is totally different and the dynamic is totally different, but really painful, beautiful book told in this non-linear style that is fascinating. Like, I don't know how this book holds together. He is constantly moving between memories of the war and a contemporary story about a writer trying to write about his experiences of the war. It's brilliant. And this writer, Bao Ninh, I don't think he ever really wrote another book. So that one was fantastic. And then I read The Invisible Woman by Claire Tomalin, which is about Charles Dickens' relationship with Nellie Ternan, who was like his mistress, I guess you'd say, for like 15 years or so. And she was an actress, a kind of relatively unsuccessful actress at a time when actresses were very, very intensely stigmatized in society. Far from like the celebrities that we see them today, these women were basically perceived as being sex workers, and it was extremely déclassé to like be an actress. If you'd had a career on the stage, you were seen as like almost socially untouchable or unmarriageable in some regards. And Dickens had this very unhappy marriage and was very, very brutal toward his wife, but he falls in love with Nellie. But because Dickens projects this image of like the consummate Victorian family man, he needs to keep Nellie a secret from the public. And so he really goes to painstaking efforts to erase her history from his own and kind of make sure that none of his biographers ever knew of her or consulted her. And in, I think, the 1980s or early 1990s, Claire Tomalin, the great English biographer, writes this book about Nellie. And it's wonderful. It reminds me of reading like Jean Strauss's biography of Alice James or something like that, where you're just kind of getting these really, really excellent sort of feminist retellings of history. So that book was incredible. And then I guess I'll give one last shout out to when I was doing the panel on Sula by Toni Morrison with Hilton Als and Kinesia Lubrin. I just read a bunch of Morrison that I'd never read before. And one of the books that I read was a short essay that she'd written, or a short book that is an essay called Playing in the Dark, which is just an unbelievable analysis of American literature, demonstrating how whiteness is constituted out of a sort of othering of the Black subject. And I think people associate Morrison much more with like understanding how Blackness is constituted. But in this book, she really talks about the construction of whiteness, which is really, really fascinating and really resonated with me, especially after having written a novella like The Events at X, which is talking about how the Canadian white settler subject is constituted by sort of othering the Indigenous subject. To see Morrison having talked about the same thing like 30 years before, no great surprise because she's a towering genius, but that book also really affected me a great deal and I recommend it.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, it's a pleasure talking with you. And yeah, we both admire your work and appreciate you taking the time to come on Craftwork.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Is there anything you want to plug?
It'll be cool if people picked up the September-October issue of The Walrus and checked out my story, More Love, that's in there.
Fabulous story. I really found it so propulsive, even though it was rather minimalist, but kind of hypnotizing. So yeah, I would recommend everybody to definitely pick up that issue of The Walrus.
Thanks so much.